That was what I want to ask you. Is my last question about how the Dzogchen teachings, the Dzogchen practices actually can be made more relevant to the wider world beyond the academic circles, beyond the circles of Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. I suppose Dzogchen will take a new shape as it transmits to the Western world in the 21st century. Longchen had his time where he had to mold that very philosophical system, Dzogchen. Jigme probably had a very ritualistic form of Dzogchen practice based on what was happening around him. And I think Mipham definitely brought scholasticism and Dzogchen together, partly because he was responding to a very scholastic milieu. So in the same way as Dzogchen is transmitted to the West in the 21st century, as you now try to make it a more widely acceptable contemplative practice, what are the challenges? How soon would it really be able to trickle down to help, for instance, high school students or college students? What should the academics, the specialists like yourself, be prioritizing to make this process work faster? Can you explain this process, the changes that's happening and changes that would be required?
Yeah, that's what I think a lot about these days, because I have, apart from like individuals, like my family and so forth, I mean, I have three great loves in this life, and one is Tibetan people and culture, one is the Tibetan land, and one is the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and particularly Dzogchen. I mean, those are the things I love. And like, when I'm thinking about 11th century Dzogchen Nyingtik or 14th century Longchenpa's writings and so forth, I mean, love really is what comes to mind first and foremost. I couldn't tell you like these are better than some other tradition. How would you say that? Like, it's like saying, hey, Karma, is your mother better than my mother? Well, I mean, she's your mother, right? You love her, and I love my mother. But so these are what I love in this life, and there are things that have a profound impact on me. Like you said early on, was this those years spent studying after that, were they enjoyable years and so forth? I don't know about enjoyable, but they shaped who I was, and I couldn't imagine myself being different. That land and those people and those traditions gave me fundamentally important, essential ways to understand myself and the world around me. And so, as I'm now in this position here at the University of Virginia, where I'm leading these efforts in the contemplative science and student flourishing, we're currently actually building a 60,000 square foot building in the middle of the campus devoted to contemplation called the Contemplative Commons. So there's an opportunity. And so I'm really asking these questions a lot, like, how do we do something that's not just mindfulness and yoga 101, like everybody is doing across North America and so forth, but how can we look back at this rich heritage of our species that's done so much experimental work in things like Dzogchen and so forth, and be able to bring some of those into new forms that are appropriate for our context and our realities. Just like you said, in Tibet, they did constantly. Even though when you talk to a Tibetan teacher, they'll make it seem like it's all the same thing over so many years, but it's not what the history tells us. History tells us Tibetans were constantly innovating, constantly changing, constantly adapting to their changed circumstances. Like this morning, I was reading your article about Buddhism and media, so looking back at the way that media has been changing over all these years with regards to Buddhism. So I think the challenges, I mean, the approach I'm taking is what I just talked about, the generative contemplation and thinking about contemplation by design and so forth. At the personal level, I think some of the challenges I feel are that I know Tibetan people and culture and traditions obviously are under a lot of pressures over the past 50 years because of things that have happened, as we all know about. And a natural reaction to those kinds of pressures is to shut down, is to be conservative, is to resist innovation, because so much is being lost, so much has been lost, and there's so many pressures you feel arrayed against you. And so you kind of want to be conservative and lock down what's left and say, no, it's got to be like this because that's how we do it and so forth. So I think that's a challenge, and it's a challenge because like that's the reality of Tibetan and Bhutanese and other Himalayan people. And these are their traditions, that they have created and nurtured and been intertwined with their individual and collective souls over so many centuries. And for us, I'm not Tibetan. I mean, I may be the father of Tibetans because I have 3 children who are half Tibetan, so I guess I have that claim to fame. But I'm not Tibetan, and so it feels problematic to like disagree with Tibetans who are lineage holders and so forth about what the future of these traditions might be or what one might do with them and so forth. And so I think that's a real challenge. Like, are there Tibetan teachers out there, ethnically Tibetan Bhutanese teachers, who are interested themselves in exploring these frontiers? And there are some I know, and there are others who definitely are opposed to that. And so I think that's a big issue. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I framed the Generative Contemplation Initiative like I did, which is, this is understanding. I don't feel bad about understanding things in a different way. But if we're not adapting, secularizing, altering, translating these practices from Tibet and Bhutan, but rather we're being inspired by how we've learned the way that they've developed contemplative fluency over so many centuries, that to me feels ethically a lot less problematic than just going in and saying, hey, I'm going to grab your practice. I know you don't like what I'm going to do with it, but I'm going to go put it over here and secularize it and use it for some other purpose. Even if my motivation is good, that feels problematic to me. And also, I'm not even sure it's really a good thing to do. Like, I mean, it'd be a good thing for Bhutanese to do, like karma punsok, but like, karma, you're part of a living, breathing Vajrayana culture. And I'm not in America. America is not a Vajrayana culture. It's not a Buddhist culture. It's a culture that's very secular, that's very Christian, and it has, threads of Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Native American religions and so forth threaded throughout. So that's a very different reality than working within Tibet or within Nepal or within Bhutan, which I'd have a very different perspective there. So I'm hopeful that over the next 5 or 10 years, as we go through this, that we will find an ever-evolving partners who are Tibetan or Bhutanese or Nepali to work with us, but that we also find people who are practitioners, who are scholars, who are people who aren't Buddhist at all, who are just interested in finding practices that can help people be more resilient, more caring, more insightful in an era where there are so many forces arrayed against us, in an era which people have called an era of toxic attention, attentional toxicity, that such practices and approaches are in more need than ever.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that's exactly why we have also started these conversations on Buddha nature, because perhaps we need more of such positive discussions and also encourage each other. I hope your big projects of bringing contemplative sciences to the larger society in the West, particularly in the US, will be successful. I mean, when I look at the Tibetan Buddhist heritage or the Buddhist heritage in general, I don't particularly see it as strictly associated with any particular geography or ethnic group. It's a universal heritage. I think it would be good to respect the integrity, but I hope our leaders will also be dynamic and flexible enough to adapt to current times. Otherwise, we'll end up being irrelevant, and being irrelevant would mean gradually disappearing into oblivion. And I think what you are doing through this generative contemplative practices or contemplative science work is extremely useful, and it's probably something that a lot of the Buddhist teachers here from the Himalayas should also start looking at to keep the timeless message going instead of remaining static and then getting lost. We have already spent over 1.5 hours. Wonderful session, and none of our well, almost all of our audience are still with us, so they must have thoroughly enjoyed it. It was such an illuminating, eloquent, gripping talk. Thank you very, very much, David. And I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. So with that, I think we should bring this session to a close. No, Marcus?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Karma. Thank you, David. It was a real treat.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to both of you. And I was also saying, you know, Karma, you're an inspiration, and the work that you've done at Loden and elsewhere is, I think, you know, shows a pathway forward for how traditional values and practices can be integrated with radical innovation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you so much.
good night from my side.
Have a wonderful
Okay.
weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.